Hello there. My name is Malcolm Macleod. I'm a professor of neurology at the University of Edinburgh, and I'd like to introduce you to James.
Good morning. Yep, my name's James Thomas. I'm down in London at UCL, where I'm a professor of social research and policy.
So, James, tell us a little bit about the Galenos project and your role in it. What it is that you bring to the project?
Galenos is a multidisciplinary and global project, and our role in it is very much around finding the research. We put together search strings, which are sort of sets of keywords to find research on databases, and we're also then working on the ubiquitous AI to sort of try and make the discovery of research more efficient. It's a little bit counterintuitive for those who are not in the research environment, but actually we spend an absolute fortune, billions and billions of pounds on services and on research, but we spend very little money on making sure that we can find research again once it's been published in order to inform what the services should look like. And so our job on this project is to sort of bridge that deficit in the way that we look after research and find research so that the team can then use the research to sort of identify new and promising treatments.
What I do on the project is to take those research articles, those research artifacts that we've identified through the process that James runs and organizes, and then find those that relate to research that's been done involving animals, that's been done with the purpose of how we might develop treatments for human problems with mental health. And as James kind of hinted, there's an awful lot of research which has been done. We think that perhaps north of 10,000 animal studies looking into treatments in psychosis, things like schizophrenia, orders of magnitude, maybe 60,000 in conditions like depression, probably the same amount in conditions like stress and anxiety. So there's a lot of information out there, but how can we start to make sense of it to try and boil that down into actionable insights that either might suggest further areas of basic research involving animals or cell culture and the like, or help us take drugs forward into clinical trial. And so the way that you can curate all this evidence and bring it together, generally that's called evidence synthesis. You're synthesizing these different bits of evidence. And that can, interestingly, give you all sorts of big data, AI approaches, if you like, to understanding where a field is going, what the hot topics are, but also some problems and some difficulties in the field that you might like to take into account. Because, again, it may be a surprise, but sometimes researchers and scientists aren't the dispassionate observers of facts, but have dogs in the fight in that they're very keen and enthusiastic about their particular ideas. And so sometimes this primary research has got biases, unconscious biases probably, but which support a particular approach or a particular point of view. And one of our jobs is to try and take a lens to those biases so that when we do decide, for instance, that we're going to take drug X to clinical trial in psychosis or intervention Y to clinical trial in post-traumatic stress disorder, then that's based on firm evidence rather than on hobby horsing and tub thumping. Perhaps is at least a risk. So, James, if I can come back to you, to a layperson, you might expect that the scientific research is published and it's there and we just need to get it. Is it that straightforward?
It would be nice if it were. And you mentioned sort of biases in what you were talking about. And we are biased in terms of our ability to find research literature. There are biases, people have, like you say, have got dogs in the fight and are particularly keen on showing that their approach to a particular treatment might be beneficial. And so there's something called the file drawer effect, where people kind of leave slightly less positive findings in their drawers and don't publish them. Or they publish them in sort of slightly less well-known journals. And so one of the problems that we've got is making sure that we uncover things like that and that we're aware that when we're looking at research literature, that we're not necessarily seeing the whole picture, which is why it takes so long to find everything. Because our main databases, we've got upwards of 200 million papers there to look through, and they're not well indexed. Google hasn't indexed them for us. We've got different systems that work on them. And it can take months to find the right research, which is why we're getting into the AI to try and it's not trying to replace the humans doing that. It's just trying to make it more feasible for us to find the papers that we actually do want to find. But I mean, I was interested in once we've got the papers, one of the really interesting things about this project is the fact that we've got so many different types of research in it. I mean, I'm very interested in when I'm doing sort of systematic reviews on evidence synthesis myself, when we've got different populations. We've got sort of populations from different parts of the world, all looking at, being evaluated using the same or similar-ish interventions. But in Galenos, it's not even just people. It's people and animals, and what I'm interested in there is how when you're looking at a set of studies, about post-traumatic stress disorder or something like that, when you've got animals and people, whether or not actually you're even looking at the same thing.
I can answer the very simple answer to that is you're definitely not looking at the same thing. And animal models are models which claim to shine a light on some particular aspects of a human condition. And so it's not that there's an animal model of schizophrenia or there's an animal model of depression, but there are some animal models where we think we can cause part of the underlying biological problem to occur. And by causing it to occur in animals, we can perhaps study it in greater detail. We can study what the cells actually look like under the microscope in a way that we wouldn't want to be able to do in humans. And we can test treatments in a way that we're not putting human subjects at risk to see if at least there's a signal that they might be promising. But of course, we don't really know how well those models work, because there's a catch-22 here that if we had, say we had a perfect model of psychosis for some feature of psychosis or some feature of schizophrenia, the way that we would know it was perfect would be because we could give a treatment to an animal model and it would work, and we could give a treatment to the human and it would work. So we'd have this thing called predictive validity. But if we had a treatment that we gave to the human that would work, we wouldn't need to do the animal research because we would have a treatment already. So there's this issue of how confident you can be and how you can put together the findings. And one of the, I think, great strengths and great innovations of the Galenos project is in the way that it's brought much more to the fore this idea of what we call triangulation. And what triangulation means is that we appreciate that you can't just map across from this research domain to this research domain and read across 100%. That's not happening. But if you get a bit of evidence here that is consistent with a completely independent set of evidence here derived from a different species or a different model, or this is from human imaging and this is from animal studies, and if they say the same thing or point in the same direction, that direction is more likely to be real than if they disagree. And if you add a third or a fourth or a fifth direction and they all are telling you the same story, then that's helpful. Now, of course, this is what researchers have done for decades. This is how biomedical research works. But the advantage of Galenos is that instead of basing this triangulation on stuff what I have read in the last couple of months out of those 250 million research artifacts that we've got, we're trying to get all of the information and put it together and then find ways in which we could exploit some of these automation tools that you've been talking about to aggregate those data really at scale. I don't know whether, I'll tell you something interesting about, it's slightly different, it's in Alzheimer's disease. So we've got one of these evidence maps from Alzheimer's disease that actually was generated by someone who now works with you, who used to work with Caitlin here, utterly brilliant young researcher, where she gathered together all the animal literature she could find about Alzheimer's disease. And then in a separate project, we were asked by colleagues in the Netherlands to try and put together all of the animal data we could find about the effects of pesticides on health.
Yeah.
Now, when you've got those two data sets, you can feed the drugs into databases that tell you where you think the drugs work, where you think they operate, what genes they interact with, what pathways they interact with, what proteins they interact. About 90% of the genes which are invoked in the pesticide literature are also represented in the Alzheimer's literature. And what that means is that the answer to Alzheimer's disease might not actually come from the Alzheimer's literature. It might be sitting there in the pesticide literature if only we knew it was there. And it's only by putting together all of this stuff at scale that we've got a chance of picking up those information.
And I think that's one of the things that seems really counterintuitive to people sort of from the outside. You'd assume that, you know, when research is done, you're sort of building on previous research, and you know whatever, you know, we know what we already know, and so therefore we can see where the gaps are, and then we do new research in a sort of fairly rational, organized way. Whereas actually it's really chaotic. We don't know what other fields have done. We don't even know what our own fields have done half the time because we're so poorly organized. And I think that's really one of the key selling points of why evidence synthesis at scale like this is needed. Because at the moment, globally, we're so chaotic about the way that we look after our research knowledge.
Yeah, I agree. And there's a huge amount of inefficiencies in the information that drains through our fingers because we don't know how to capture it.
Yeah.
That could potentially accelerate discovery. But I'm interested in how the AI field is approaching these problems and whether there might be similar wastefulness or inefficiencies in the way that new AI tools are developed and tested and applied and rolled out, or is AI really, really good and nothing bad like that ever happens?
Well, computer science is like any science, but I've noticed now that I've seen it in action slightly from the outside, though I'm doing more and more from the inside, that it's very fashion orientated in that, you know, 10 years ago or more, there was this thing called text mining, and it was going to solve all our problems. And text mining was about creating rules to teach machines how to read, essentially. And then machine learning came along, and machine learning kind of pushed the old way of thinking about this aside because you could suddenly get models which you didn't need to teach the rules. The rules were sort of discovered for themselves. And, you know, with increasing computation power and better models, essentially these big language models now, it looks as though you don't need to create those rules. What you can do is just give the machines vast amounts of text and they kind of will figure it out for themselves. The problem is that when you do that, the scale of text being used is just everything you can see online. And everything you see online is very imperfect. A lot of it's not even, you know, a lot of it is factually incorrect. A lot of it's very biased. A lot of it's very unpleasant. And all of those ways of thinking and ways of articulating human experience are all encoded in these models. So we have to use them very, very carefully. And there's lots of stories about how inaccurate they are. But I think one of the challenges we've got is there's just now so much hype and so much money flying around trying to make more money for the people who put venture capital into some of these startup companies that we're starting to be quite unscientific about the way in which we can look at the research literature using language models. And so the danger is we're getting some tools coming through which are very seductive. They pretend you can do an evidence synthesis in 10, 20 minutes, and you can't. And the challenge we've now got is bridging that gap between, oh, you can do it in 10, 20 minutes, and still this world where it does actually take us quite a long time to actually look at the research. Like you say, you know, you have to look at the biases in the research. You have to look at how well conducted it was. You have to look to see whether or not you can put this study together with something else. And at the moment, the danger is that the field's just moving to sort of, I don't know, put everything together in a very unsystematic way. So that's my concern. The good part is that we are starting to use the language models productively. We are seeing situations where we can basically set some rules so that we can do Galanos reviews more quickly. So there's challenges and there's benefits.
So I don't know very much about all of this stuff at all, but I hear about stuff called generative AI large language models.
Yeah.
You might get it to generate new content or new material, and almost a sort of analytical large language model type approach where you'd use it to understand a given set bit of literature, not the whole of the world, but a set bit of literature. So when you've done your information retrieval for Galenos, and that system delivers to me a group of 10 publications that relate to a particular factor, do you think there's a space for AI there in summarizing those papers, just what's in those papers, and coming to a conclusion? Or is even that still a bit wonky? Or do we just not yet know whether it's any good?
Yeah, partly we don't know. I mean, I think that there are sort of three levels of what you've talked about there. So there's the language models, and the language models fundamentally are a model of language. And if you use them like that, then they're really quite powerful things. What they aren't are databases. So what we shouldn't do is go to ChatGPT and treat it as though it can retrieve information for us, because it's basically not designed that way. It can give us plausible answers for things which are commonly found in its training data, but it's not really the mechanism that we should use to actually generate answers. But what we can do is we can use a language model on individual papers, and there, when we can extract information, the accuracy seems okay, but we need more research.
Yeah.
Where we're not so sure yet is looking across research studies and summarizing across studies, because there again, at the moment, we need to look at the biases. We need to look at the different types of studies, and so at the moment we're not even experimenting with looking at summarizing across studies.
I had an interesting conversation one step removed with someone who, in a different field, is interested in how you take data from the literature and feed it into drug selection for what we call repurposing trials. Now, repurposing trial is where you take a drug that's already on the market for something else, and you think, well, there's a suggestion it might work in this condition. Can we try it in this condition? And our approach has been to say, well, let's get all of the information we can and put it into a big soup and stir it around a little bit and see what comes out, with some attention given to the provenance of the different bits of information that might feed in. But we'll take everything, partly because of the issue that you mentioned earlier on about publication bias. And this guy was saying, actually, that just creates, in his view, that creates so much noise because so much of it is unreliable that his favorite approach is just to draw a quality threshold line and say only things that are higher than the threshold will we take. And it's really difficult to work out the optimum balance between what you would include in your analysis and whether you might have a kind of sliding scale of we'll weight this evidence really highly and this evidence less highly. And given that takes humans, it's such a complicated process for humans to do, even if they're trained in the process, that I think it might be some way away before AI-based approaches can have that similar level of discernment of weighing different evidence sources according to the provenance of what's presented.
I agree, though, and I do think that some of those data mining approaches are situations where you can benefit from the scale that you can get from the computation power we've got now and from the language models, because you can literally put the whole of the research literature into something like this, and then if you can manage to make those connections, and I think that's where the skill of the humans needs to come in terms of telling the machine what they want to find. But there you can scale up way beyond what a research team is able to do, because you can look at the whole of essentially the whole of research.
I think just to try and bring together what we've each been saying, Glenos is an interesting project, a super project to be involved with, because we're getting a chance to use and develop and extend these new tools. It's clear from what you've been saying and from my experience with it that the idea that you can have a wind-up AI machine that you throw at a literature and 5 seconds later it spits out an answer, we're a million miles away from that. Yeah. But there are some human processes which are involved in evidence synthesis where these AI-based approaches can really, really help save effort. And by saving effort, they allow us to paint a much broader picture of a field of research than was possible before, because that human effort can be used where it really makes a difference, rather than having to do all of these tasks. You think that's a fair summary?
I think that's a very fair summary.
Excellent. Well, it's been lovely to speak to you. I think our time is up. And let's look forward to the final fruits of the Glenos project, and hopefully to more Glenos and other work in this space in the future.
Nice to chat. Thank you.